My honor to welcome our chair, Dr. Prakash Narayan. Dr. Narayan is a former IAS officer who has civil service, but has governed legal reforms, the Foundation for Democratic Reforms, and Law Curriculum. He has served on the National Fiscal Council and the State Administrative Reforms Commission and has consistently advocated institutional, parliamentary, and federal reforms. Let me invite our eminent panelists. Sri Hasibe Gabdo is an economist and former finance minister of Jammu and Kashmir. He has served in the advisory role in the planning of the Finance Commission and the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. Professor Enna Maniguri, Director, Madras School of Economics, Executive Economics. He has served on several committees of the Finance Ministry, RBI, SEBI, and Niti Aayog. Sri P.V. Ramesh, retired IAS, former Principal Finance Secretary, Government of Andhra Pradesh, and he is the former chairman and managing director of the Govt Administration Corporation. Next, we have Sri Bhaskar IAS. He might join us later. Without further delay, let's start the session.
Friends, while this is the last session of the day, arguably it's going to be very challenging across a very diverse issue. With Dr. Fera here, here. I guarantee you it's going to be very proud. And we have very wonderful panelists, banker, economist, politician, and a former finance minister, a distinguished academic, former civil servant, a physician, and a former finance secretary. I think it will be very exciting. Let me start off with a few remarks, and I will use a few slides just to start off the whole thing so we get some focus. Some listeners have fond of Thomas Sowell. I know he's a very controversial economist. He said the first lesson of economics is scarcity. There is never enough of anything to satisfy all those who want it. The first lesson of politics is disregard the first lesson of economics. I think that's pretty much evident in our country. And Ramakrishna Rao sort of highlighted that. The Chief Secretary today, former Finance Secretary for a very long period, probably the longest period in the history of any state. But that's the context in which we're speaking. Let me put a few slides here. I am reiterating the point made by Dr. Brown. It's not that there's a huge cake available. It is that we have limited resources, that's what poverty means. It is that we have to somehow figure out a way. And just to put the picture what Dr. Brown said, about 60% of the total expenditure of the governments in India is at the state level, the highest among all federal countries in the world. If you include the total expenditure, about 37% is by the union, only 3% by the local governments, the lowest in the world among federal countries, or perhaps any country worth mentioning. I think when we discuss things, maybe it's worthwhile to remember this big picture. And the transfer of resources, we don't talk about Finance Commission devolution, the constitutional devolution, even Finance Commission, other grants are ignoring. I'm sure many of you realize, academics would understand, but other scientists will not realize. Local government grants and the disaster management is beyond the 40 months. And in any case, pardon my use of central, I hate the word central, but it's called central responsive scheme, so I can't change the designation, but I can't change those. And some other transfers, including the union government's transfer in the form of actually loan between the grant, 50 years interest free grant. You give me $1 billion today, 50 years interest rate, I'll be taking. So we say that this loan is more for accounting purposes. If you take it into account, 54% of the total revenues of the union government, tax, non-tax, cess, surcharge, everything put together, excluding capital receipts, dividends, etc., or debt. If you take only the tax revenues, including surcharge and cess, it comes to about 56-57%. If you take only, if you exclude the tax revenues, non-tax revenues, If you take only the tax revenues, it's actually more than 60%. So it's not that there's much more there. The 60-40 formula that Suma mentioned. And the union government, I think Professor Char talked about structural deficit of some states. Questionable. What is structural in the states? But union government actually is structural deficit. If you take the salaries, pensions, interest payments alone, after transfers to states, union government is practically a deficit. This is where varying states, some states are doing a superb job. Some states are doing a pretty difficult job. Andhra Pradesh now debt GDP ratio, if you actually take into account of budget loans and the pending base, not reflected anywhere in our numbers, including RBI reports. I've been kind of Andhra Pradesh and Telangana because they are my home states. And also we have data about these two states, pending base. It is 61% before Andhra Pradesh. Telangana is 49% the state, the start of the largest surplus according to 14th Finance Commission. The state was formed. A very rich state by any account. They are doing a terrible job of finance management. Other states will be this. The fact that some states, including some of the poorer states, are doing a remarkable job shows it's not an impossibility. In the short term, the flow part against mentioned flow was the stock. If you take only the three committed expenditure items for which you have no discretion whatsoever, and that is salaries, pensions, and interest payments, no government can do anything in the short, medium time. If you take the total revenues, including the devolution by public states, Andhra Pradesh is spending 94% on committed expenditure. Telangana is not that bad because Telangana is a small state with a very big city, which is the economic center. But Punjab, Himachal Pradesh, West Bengal, they're in dire straits. Revenue deficit to some discussion that maybe we'll have a more meaningful discussion today because I'm going to provoke you to some discussion on the subject. Again, several states have been pretty in this situation. So I'll conclude now what to do. I'm making a very humble proposal. We have to do something. Not doing anything is not much. At the same time, the union cannot tell the states what to spend on. It's none of the union's business. Because states are sovereign within their province of state subjects. Or concurrent subjects to the extent that they have direct control of them. But can we ensure that the boundary conditions are fixed as well as fulfilled? If that's not done, there's no nation. If that's not done, there's no meaning of federalism, there's no meaning of fiscal responsibility. And I would like to reiterate the point I made earlier in the introduction. The Constitution makes us very advisedly use two expressions, the financial stability of India, the credit of India. These are union subjects. And if we don't want to invoke extreme provisions after a crisis, actually full-blown crisis in the country or several states, and Article 360, the financial emergency, in which case some of you may not be aware, the government acquires the power to reduce salaries and pensions, the only contingency in which you actually can reduce salaries and pensions. So government employees are aware. If you think there is an blank check, you can do pretty much what you want, there could be serious problem. Now, what I propose is, could we make one standard, a golden rule economists call, that there should be no revenue deficit. You cannot immediately enforce it, depending on the state, gives them some time, 3, 4, 5 years, depending on the state's current finances. Have a roadmap, but let's stick to that. Now, how do you enforce it? I believe government of India has dropped the ball. While they have the constitutional responsibility and authority, they have dropped the ball in general because of political considerations. After all, if a state wants to be propagated, the government of India has to enforce discipline. It's very easy to say, they're stopping me from helping you. After all, the electorate is there for everybody. Politics is there for every political party in the country. They don't want to manpower. But supposing, once the boundary conditions are fixed, the actual decision making is transferred to an independent authority. Fiscal Council is talked about. I have no realistic expectation of a Fiscal Council not being created with a 5 years. But could we utilize something like, say, the CAG, expand the limit a little bit more? And Government of India will simply go by the CAG's recommendation. And there is a precedent. If you take the disqualification of legislators in office, not on defection grounds, but other grounds, the Constitution says the matter shall be referred by the President, public, the Governor, and the Election Commission. And the Commission's report, the recommendation is binding. There is no discretion on the part of the President at all. Supposing Government of India voluntarily accepts this obligation, that we will go by the recommendation of the CAG, which in turn will be based on certain norms which are accepted across the country. The committee of experts can sit. I personally believe that revenue deficit is nothing measurable, verifiable. And no government has the right to spend recklessly without creating durable, wealth-creating assets for the future generations. I know Dr. Prabhu questioned that research on these questions is actually good in some respects. I'm sure it's a point to be contested, debated, and then we can be debated. So if that is the case, if that body takes care of what to do about the state's finances when recommending the approval of a debt under Article 293, because the only tool that the Government of India has is Article 293. Even FRB is actually a sort of distraction. It should be Article 293 that gives the power to the Union Government, the responsibility. Under 293.3, you have to approve every debt. Under 293.4, you can impose such conditions as a deem fit, in the interest of the financial health of the country or the state. There is no other recourse away. And therefore, my appeal is, can we overcome the opaque accounting practices? Can we overcome the unfunded future pension liabilities? West Bengal was mentioned by Mr. Chalk. West Bengal is the only state that still is pursuing with the old pension system. A few other states reverted to OPS, and now I think something else is happening in some other states like I think Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Himachal Pradesh, and Punjab. You cannot do this in detriment to the next generation and then complain that we have a structural deficit. The people of India are not obliged to pay you for your political decisions. There are fiscal consequences to political decision making. There's no choice. Therefore, the Government of India's obligation is not really about taking care of your deficits and anything, not telling you what to do, what not to do, but having the voluntary conditions and enforcing them in a fair and transparent manner. And in that, apart from the revenue deficit, how do you make sure that if there is a future liability incurred, that there is a fund created? The government has the perfect right to say, 30 years later, I'm legally bound to give you out of this. But please put away the right to this contract. This is today in this fund. You cannot burden the next generation. The decision that you take today without creating an asset. One additional point, capital expenditure. Earlier I thought capex is the resolution good. Telangana taught me very important lesson. A lot of expenditure, college level. Many of the very profligate, high cost vanity projects. Money is spent, that is mounted without any durable asset or trade or wealth creation. Therefore, there has to be some check on the cost benefit analysis of the capital above a certain amount of expenditure before a debt is approved. If you lose the own surplus resources, perfect all that. Otherwise, I think again the government has to come. Transparency of accounting, that's the last one I'd like to make. States have mastered the art of budgeting their accounts. Union budget in general, if you read it, you have a sense of what's happening. I'm sure there's something concealed there also. Experts here will know much better. But states, no matter how carefully you read, you just don't get a picture of it. Even RBI reports don't really contain the full picture. Our budget flows are often not taken into account. Escrow accounts, for the first time in the history of the country, directly the tax money is flowing into private coffers in the form of debt repayment without the treasury, some country. Not pending bills. 130,000 crores pending bills in Andhra Pradesh. 120,000 or 110,000 crores officials have to be in the latest picture. Telangana. Not reflected anywhere. Until you have an improved system of accounting, until actually payments are made. Year after year, payments are not made. This cannot be. This is my humble suggestion. At least some small things could be done without in any way impeding on the sovereignty of the states or the autonomy of the states, but protecting the country. one last. I started with Thomas. So let me, Thomas Jefferson. He said, no generation has a right to contract debts greater than can be paid off during the course of its own existence. That's a bit too conservative. At least greater than that can be paid off by the welfare agent by the debt. That's, I think, a reasonable part of it. Let me stop at this and now request our panelists to make their points of view. As I said, it was a very strongly discussion. First, Professor Trout.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sanjay, for getting me to come here. For me, Hyderabad is very significant because my guru comes from there, which is BPR. Whatever I know about state finances, I learned from him in the 10th Commission. And my interest in state finances really is driven by BPR. Having said that, I must strongly object to the statement made here by the chair that state budgets are about fudging. I think a finance minister presented 5 budgets. I did not fudge. And I can sit offline. No, it's not about that. I can sit offline with you and show you how union government fudged budget after budget helped by the planning commission to create myths that didn't exist in the form of PCRs. How states were made to fudge their accounts only to get away with all those things. So it's very, very unfair to say this, that states are fudging, and this is something that has a history to it. When, and I'm just using this as a name, not as something, when a Subbarao was finance secretary of Andhra, he's the best finance secretary. When the same Subbarao goes to center, he starts thinking that and I'm not talking about Subbarao that he did this, but the point being, states, when you have your own civil servants, when they go to center, they start looking at their quality of suspicion. And that, I think that's a source of problem. You always get me think that you know much more when you are at the center, but actually most of the reforms that have happened at the state level. Now, to the substantive point, I mean, it's still comes to me, I remember how RBI dividends were raised by Chalaya to cover the deficits. I know how oil pool accounts were, money was shifted to cover the fiscal deficit. What are you talking about fudging by the states? Look at the fudging by the center and the kind of stuff that was being done month after month of monetizing of deficits. For 30 or 29 days, you would run high deficits. On the accounting Friday, you would bring it down. That is not fudging. But what a state government does is fudging. I mean, it's not acceptable. Having said that, what is the big trend that one sees here? Successive finance commissions. And I think one of the best statements ever made on finance commission was by a gentleman called Puhan. The younger generation will not know him. But as Puhan said, finance commission is a dog that barks at the states, barks at the center and fights the states. That has continued with every single commission. The big trend is successive finance commissions have done or are trying to do to the divisible pool what was done to the Gadgil pool. If you remember, there used to be a Gadgil pool with a Gadgil formula, which eventually became Mukherjee Gadgil formula, like it now become Panikriya formula by doing some tweaking. What happened in the Gadgil formula? There was a transparent formula exactly like the finance commission formula, which would divide for per capita, distance, income, equity, all that. What is central government doing? Quietly and systematically reduce the inflow of the Gadgil pool, so that what went through the Gadgil pool was shrinking, and use that money to give to the ministries and created this centrally sponsored scheme company. And it was done by the planning commission in consultation with the finance ministry. And that's how states were deprived. And that is how politics work, with 3 states in 5 years getting 78% of the centrally sponsored schemes. Now, exactly the same strategy being tried here. What are you trying to do? If you look at cession, that has been discussed extensively, that you have increased cessions, particularly after GST. It was 10%, it's gone up 20%. What are you doing? You are preempting resources from going into the consumer. And what then gets to the states through the divisible pool is much less than it ought to have been, which has been now established. And we are not even talking of how the PSU royalty, the dividends, the RBI dividends come into play. They are outside, not about cesses. It's about royalty. And I'll come to that a little later. So, and I think we focus only on devolution in the theory is because we should start talking about total statutory transfers. Let's go back to the basics. It was about constitutionally guaranteed statutory transfers. Money is fungible. Whether it goes through devolution or it goes through grant state, it goes to the state budget. It is fungible across the state. That particular part with this commission has now peaked. That you have definitely, and it was discussed quite a lot here, is the whole issue of revenue deficit grants. That since you have taken away the revenue deficit grants, you have actually reduced the total statutory transfers. Those have come down, and that is a concern. So it is also two things are happening. One, you are moving out of the deficit, so it doesn't become, it becomes less, it becomes more criteria driven. And you move to revenue to the grant side, which was a single criteria. What was the revenue deficit grant? The other issue which I specifically referred to is why it's right that revenue deficit grant should have been abolished, but it should have been abolished only after you change the criteria. The criteria of the evolution have evolved in a closed economy when you had a taxation regime which was consumer oriented. It is a destination regime. Who were the revenue deficit states? All the consuming states. The producer states were not getting revenue deficit grants, whether they were Tamil Nadu or nothing. It was consumer states. Now, with the taxation becoming a destination-based taxation for GST, all the consuming states have benefited. Hence, they will not need the benefit. Does that mean to abolish it? No. Perhaps what is required is that you need to change the criteria and look at it in terms of total transfers, because now you have prevented, you are actually giving these grants to subvert the states. And this whole point about instead of decentralization, we are actually aiding centralization through resource transfers. It's a regime today that works with PM in between the entire layers on. And you will not, and there can be no better example of it, of how to be subverted than JNK where I come from. A fully empowered state gets converted to a UT without any constitutional sanction, with whatever. After that, a new layer of third layer is created called DDCs, District Development Councils, which are elected bodies. Constitution doesn't allow any third body to be elected. You create another level to do what? To disempower the state legislature. So, if you want to see it from that perspective, then the whole trend is towards extensive centralization. Which is why I was saying it is not about cooperative federalism, it is not about competitive federalism, it is not about combative federalism, it is about coercive federalism, good and proper. Second point, I keep hearing this, and I've heard this forever since the 10th Commission, of how the center is a paragon of fiscal virtue and states are the vagabond states who provide money. And there's actually no, I don't know, there cannot nothing farther from the truth than this. Both in terms of, and the whole desire is, that let us make states accountable. Who is there to make the center? I have seen bureaucrats, extremely well-known bureaucrats, someone like Amitabh Kant saying, let us name and shame states for making fiscal equity. What are you talking here? These are legitimate governments elected by people. What right does anyone have to name, shame, make them accountable? They are accountable to the people. If people don't vote for them, if they don't manage their fisc well or don't govern well, they'll be thrown out. Exactly like the center. So where is this whole thing of moral social coming from? That I am sitting on this big pedestal and I have to monitor you. Everybody talks about conscience. I think Mr. Jha talked extensively about conscience in debates. Can I remind you, sir, In 1946, November, Jawaharlal Nehru put out a resolution called the Objectives Resolution in the Parliament Assembly, which was passed by the Govt Assembly, where states had all the powers, residuary powers also. Only three things were left to the center: defense, foreign affairs, and communication, which eventually became 370 for GNP. Only three things. It was approved by the Constitution. Fully empowered state, center had no powers. Then, Cabinet plan failed in June. And then the need was felt that we must have a strong center, because otherwise the fiscal is concerned. It was a ploy to avoid partition. Now, if that is the kind of sense you have federalism, you must look at it from that perspective. But I'll give you one example very recent of how virtual the center is. In 25-26, the gross tax revenue of the center are estimated to be 42 lakh crores. This is the peak. When I come to revise estimates, it's 40 lakh crores. 2 lakh crores is a shortfall. 41% of the 2 crores is a shortfall for states. Center doesn't meet its target. Why is it showing up as a state deficit? And what is the state deficit? It is 2 lakh crores, collectively. Right? How do I meet these 2 lakh crores? I have done nothing. I was a finance minister. I see the budget number that is given to me. I put it and do my budget. I do a balance budget. I can't do any deficit financing. I have this. Over the months, I realized month after month there is a shortfall. Why? Because the center hasn't done its job. They promised me 42 lakh crores. They have collected 40 lakh crores. 41% of that, I am suffering the shortfall. It is showing up as my gap. Nobody talks about this. What are they talking about? Off-budget borrowings. What is the off-budget borrowing in 24-25? 30,000 crores. If I am suffering a shortfall of 2 lakh crores, I have done brilliantly well to only do 30,000 crores of my pension borrowings. Otherwise, how will I balance my budget? Now, this used to be really every single year. I have myself studied in the Tax Commission that all the fiscal slippages of the states were because of the center. It is much less now, but I was giving you an example of the most recent one, where even today, for 2 lakh crores shortfall has caused havoc among the state governments. So the point really was that can I now that we know that revolutionary grants have been abolished, how do I use up your asking what do we do with them? How about ensuring a minimum guaranteed revolution? Use this particular thing to ensure that there is stability in the state budgets. Otherwise, state budgets become very volatile and they become in this, the whole thing becomes very unstable. If I guarantee, because I have this corpus now, which otherwise is being used to do all kinds of stuff, including at some point you go to defense and other things, why not ensure a certain system which is transparent that I will give you minimum guaranteed? Plus, why are very shorter borrowings? The macroeconomic implications of the borrowings of state governments are much less, much less. But I would certainly agree with Montek's point that let the market link the spreads to the fiscal performance of the state, you will have a much better sales story. So, I just said, my time is up. The point really is you cannot do much in the current system to design for a particular economy. Responsibility will come with power. As Spider-Man used to say, with great responsibility comes power. With great power comes responsibility. First, you need power. You have disempowered, the center has disempowered the states in different ways. Globalization disempowered. Today, we have a regulatory state which is running the entire country's economic policies. What role do states have in regulatory? Nothing. This is the commodity economy with resources, whether it is water or coal or money. What resources are shared with states? You're not even ready to index or royalty, let alone kind of give certain. So let us not also look at fiscal federalism from a very narrow prism of revolution. Let there be resources federalism, let there be regulatory federalism, let us start looking at monetary policy federalism. Fiscal policy is no longer driving this economy. What is driving this economy is monetary policy. What role do I have to play? I suffer the consequence of monetary policy decisions, whether it's my borrowing or whatever else. Yet I don't even the RBI's regional boards don't even meet to take inputs about what are your different issues, whether it's inflation or commodities or whatever. So studies start looking at those issues. I close by two things. I think the biggest challenge comes now in terms of federalism. There's two things: resources and preservation. We need to look at both. Resources, we discussed. I think there is definitely a great need to, I think what is referred to it is representation, which in terms of deregulation will actually cause a huge shake-up in the entire federal system. And the only way to start navigating that change is not to just look at vertical federalism, which is looking up at what Central India means, but start thinking in terms of lateral federalism, where states start helping each other do best. And that's one thing I remember from GST Council. Besides everything else, what it did was to be a forum for sharing best practices across states and helped enormously. So perhaps looking at how does one design a new federal compact along the line which includes the whole concept of lateral federalism, where you could actually look at different provincial combinations. Thank you very much.
Basically, debate, he guarantees that. And thank you for stimulating the minds. May I now request Professor Bhanumoorthy to make a presentation. Better to use you.
So much for this invitation. I'm speaking with various officers and finance minister. So I will try to answer now here. We also had a similar exercise last week, yesterday, in Madras School of Economics. And I think the general view is not very different from what we have done in the morning, that the report is very well written. And there are some issues, but in terms of issues, I think there's one comment that came up yesterday was that there are 5 vice persons in the commission, but there are 6 mistakes. So I think that is a mistake. That is something that came up yesterday. And we talked so much about revenue deficit grants. And yesterday, one of the speakers said that there is nothing but fiscal deficit. Okay, if you go to the dentist to fill the gap, it actually goes widening for a period of time. But I think what I want to say is that we had a similar discussion yesterday. Since this session is on fiscal consolidation, now that I have done some work for last 4 commissions, 13th, 14th, and 15th, as well as for the 16th Finance Commission, I just wanted to, I agree with the chair that whether we need to have revenue deficit at all. And based on my own assessment, it's a very simple exercise. Actually, if you look at it at a macro level, we have 2 identities. One is the nominal GDP growth, which should be distributed as real GDP growth plus inflation. And the mirror image for that is that fiscal deficit should be equal to your capital expenditure plus revenues. So there is just a mirror image. How you distribute the fiscal deficit between capex as well as RD will determine the distribution of nominal GDP growth between real GDP growth and inflation. If somebody wants to understand how it works, they need to contrast between the post-global financial crisis and the experience in the post-COVID period, where we have seen 4 or 5% GDP growth with 12% inflation in the post-global financial crisis, because we have seen a larger stimulus through revenue deficit. But in the post-COVID period, where we have seen larger capex focus, which led to, in fact, almost zero inflation with 7.5% GDP growth. I think that is what actually is fiscal consolidation. So I do believe that bringing the revenue deficit to zero will actually help the macro stability that we are talking about. And in fact, again, as I said, based on my own exercise, the causality actually goes from the capital expenditure to GDP growth, to the revenue, total revenues and total revenues to the revenue expenditure. So if you follow this causality, actually at the end of the day, you actually get more resources for revenue expenditure compared to if you go through the revenue deficit expansion. So I think that is empirically done, and I think it is there in many of these finance commission reports. Even in this commission, we did some work. So the 73.1%, actually it was 75.1%, which our own study has suggested. If I had knocked down 2% because my base year was 2% more than the actual. So in that sense, they knocked down 2%. So they targeted 73.1% at the public debt to GDP ratio. If you look at in terms of vertical devolution, I thought this is very important table, the whole finance commission report. The 7.4 number, 7.4 is important because a lot of discussion about the states are getting less than what finance commission recommended. So in that sense, if you look at that particular table, and after two adjustments, you actually see the devolution to the states is exactly 41% in the 15th Finance Commission period and 42% in the 14th Finance Commission. So I think those who are here from the government, I think we need to bring that particular document the table on a regular basis so that there is no confusion between the states and the Senate. In terms of the session surcharges, I think we have discussed so much. I'm not going to talk on that. In terms of horizontal devolution, I think again some of us attended this Vizag meeting. I think Dr. Joseph and Dr. G.R. Reddy and we all attended that meeting. There are many suggestions that we have made to the Finance Commission. So one of the things that we made was, bringing the efficiency back to the whole devolution package. In fact, for the 15th Finance Commission, we did one study as, in terms of assessing the public expenditure efficiency at the state level. Unfortunately, they just referred the study in the report, but they have not taken any action. So, at least I am personally glad that efficiency has been brought back to the devolution formula. If you look at, of course, the variable that they have used is GDP, and we have, I think again there was so much discussion about that. In fact, they have not used the GDP as such; they have used the square root of GDP, and I think the whole purpose is to not to have too much of shocks to the states. I will show you one graph where the devolution across the commissions were actually extremely smooth. And so basically they argue that to moderate the dispersion between the states, they wanted to square root of the GDP. But it's not very clear whether the contribution to GDP can be taken as a efficiency they talk about. But instead of GDP as an efficiency measure, in fact, GDP is nothing but the tax base. The tax base cannot be replaced with a tax effort. And that is something that we argued. And in fact, one of the mistakes that they have done, I think, they used one instrument for two targets. I think that is something where income actually comes in two places: income distance and also contribution. Right. So you have used one variable for both positive and negative assessment. So one instrument for two targets is something what we call it as over-identification or whatever. In terms of the expenditure efficiency, as I said, outlay outcome framework could have been much better. Instead of talking about production efficiency, they should have gone for expenditure efficiency, and that's exactly what our study did for the 15th Finance Commission. I think in the Vizag conference, we also talked about can we use GST as the efficiency thing. And this is one thing I want to put forth to all of everybody here. That in the planning commission era, we had so much talk about incremental capital output. Now, I think there is absolutely no estimate of incremental capital output ratios, never at the state level, but even at the central level, we don't have, at the union level, all India level, we don't have those kind of estimations. In the absence of that, very difficult for us to assess what is the efficiency that's happening at the state. But the clearest data is produced by RBI, even that covers only about 15 states. Maybe if we focus more on that particular study and expand the number of states, maybe that will be very useful for going forward. I'm actually glad about ending the revenue deficit grants. Those who know how it is estimated, I mean, all India GDP we cannot predict properly for next 1 year. Okay, when we are talking about GSDP production for next 5 years, it reminds me about Dr. Reddy's comment on India's GDP. I don't want to get into that, but actually, that's something I thought is absolutely messy kind of a affair. And I'm glad that the current finance committee actually discontinued that. In fact, this reminds me the dissent note that was submitted to the 14th Finance, where one of the members actually dissented about the recommendations, where you retain the revenue deficit grants and bring down the total, transfers to 8%. Maybe that would have been much better than that we have right now. See, this is another thing. Argument against revenue deficit grants is actually that the revenue deficit grants, which actually reduces the fiscal reforms. And I think this is an ethical question that some of those who are working in public finance need to undertake. I just put that graph for simplicity. You really see quite what happens. The blue line is basically the actual dispersion where you have better performing state and the low performing state. But if you take the square root, actually it's smoother. So it reduces the dispersion. I just thought yesterday I was like to do for my PhD student, but I thought for simplicity I just brought out this particular map. This is about the changes in shares. And this is the kind of revolution shares across the 3 commissions. You see how stable it is. I don't know either what is warranted or at least in terms of predictability, you don't see much deviation between the 3 finance commissions. I think this could be one reason why they went for the square root of GDP, although they think that it is. In that sense, likely this is the structural break where that you bring the efficiency, maybe going forward, you will see that the weightage of the efficiency might go up in that. So, in terms of the fiscal, if the particular chapter, again, as I was looking at 15th as well as 14th Finance Commission, this particular commission, I think there's not much of clarity in terms of the overall macro fiscal framework, except that they brought that conditions on union as well as the state, 3.5%. They assume that 11% of the GDP assumption. On the FRLs, I mean, there's a lot of discussion about union is violating the FRB, right? But I think this report actually brings out it's not just the union. Many states actually violate the FRB. So the argument that if only union is actually violated is not really true. And of course, I think our students actually think that's only union as well, but it's not actually. So this is my last slide. There are some concepts. One of the things which again, my 14th Finance Commission also did the same mistake. Even now, there is again same mistake in 16th Finance Commission. The most anticipated fiscal shock is the pay commission, right? So to the 14th Finance Commission, the whole macro fiscal arithmetic actually died within 1 month because immediately after the Finance Commission report, the 7th Pay Commission came out, the whole FRB and roadmap has actually gone out of the way. So I think this is exactly going to happen to the 16th Finance Commission. But we did the assessment, and we done that to our Finance Commission website. What would be the impact of the Pay Commission on the overall macro fiscal framework? And we said that we're going to be pushing the public debt equilibrium should be at least 4 to 5%. So that is, and I think migration issue, again, we brought this in the Isaac conference. We said that there are states which are actually burdened with more migration. I think they should have been brought up in that whole devolution package. And I think my one last point is that I think day after tomorrow we are going to see a new GDP numbers. Okay, so we don't know what is the shape of the GDP numbers, but now that GDP becomes a reference point for a fiscal assessment, I think we'll see a very, very different GDP or GSDP calculation. I think like Ashiv was talking about in the morning about the GSDP. In fact, only 6 or 7 states are actually implementing the Dollar committee recommendation. There's clearly it is there, but then it is left to the states to really follow the kind of methodology that they want. And at least if they follow the Dollar committee recommendations, I think we'll have some kind of uniformity in terms of estimation of GDP and GSDP at the state level. Let me stop.
Thank you, Professor Balmakar. Thank you for pointing out the contradictions now. Income distance on the other one hand and the GDP contribution on the other hand. Now, in a complex and diverse federal country, I suppose one of these are negative. In Telugu, there is a problem. Government is upper government accounts. You have to somehow balance it away. Krishna Bhaskar is a bright young civil servant, burdened with the task of managing finances in Telangana state. Much of it, of course, has been written by the successful governments in the last 14 years, but unfortunately, the civil servant is situated with reconcile about this. Krishna.
Thank you, sir. I was first beginning by confessing that it's been a very long time since I've actually worked in the finance department. It's almost 16 months. My colleagues here will attest to the fact. I now work in the power sector. And in that sense, I have to confess right at the outset that speaking in a galaxy of such distinguished scholars and practitioners, many of whom I have grown up idolizing, I speak with 3 very strong drinkers, and which may be taken, and you can call them 3 bags of salt, which you may add to whatever I say here.
Firstly, given that Krishna, maybe you can focus a little on power sector, one of the greatest management.
Let's start there. So, I mean, first part I want to talk about is, I just want to make very 3 disclaimers here. First of all, I stand heavily constrained by the lack of my experience as compared to many august and distinguished minds here. The second, and which constraint which I feel is equally relevant, is I still continue to work in government. And therefore, I will have to go back to office not even tomorrow morning, right from here. And I will be subject to certain very probing questions from my immediate boss and his own boss. And therefore, I shall speak keeping that in mind. My third disclaimer is, I have only worked in mostly in the finance and power sectors with a brief interlude in the industry sector. So I have blinkers there. So whatever I say may kindly be interpreted in the light of that very specific context. First of all, I was very privileged to hear all the opinions expressed here. With Raghu right next to me, I mentioned, great power comes great responsibility. I find that to be a very interesting statement, but I find it more interesting in its inverse. In that sense, usually when you study logic, when you're told when A leads to B, it is not necessary that B leads to A. However, it is necessary that B bar leads to A bar. So if I say, if the streets are wet, it means there has been rain. It's not necessarily the other way around. However, I can use it the other way around. If there is no rain, probably the streets are wet, presuming that you're first taking the street. So when you say with great power comes great responsibility, it does not stand to reason with great responsibility comes great power. However, if with great power comes great responsibility, the lack of responsibility will also lead to the lack of power. I shall attempt to, in as diplomatic as language as possible, to explain what I'm coming from. Essentially, the power sector across, and of course I speak with very, very heavy context to my own state here, the power sector where I work for, is it has become a game of serial borrowings. And I'm not sure I should be speaking much more than that. At some point of time, all of us have to get our act together. And I'll try to make that point in a better fashion after the next 3 points I make, which I'll be closing very quickly. My idea, having read the very finely written report, is that the future of fiscal stress, at some point, we will have to move beyond budgets, which don't tell us very well a lot, and start looking at public sector balance sheets. That is where the real game starts. That is where the real story is told. And essentially, when I mean public sector, I just don't mean power utilities. So I'm of course biased that way. I also mean water utilities. I mean transport corporations. I mean the entire ecosystem of any institutional entity which runs on those sifting sands of what we now call governance. And therefore, future, like I said, and if you have to go there, and I think the Commission's report also talked about nearly 1,600 public sector units which are actually in losses. But this is the problem beyond just that. It is not beyond losses. It is creating an ecosystem where in some sense, there are incentives to take up a lot of myopic behavior, which could be very, very detrimental in the long run. The other point I want to talk about, and this also the report has talked about, I think, in chapter 12. We are not measuring assets created with the same rigor as the risk being accumulated. And in my language, in my lived experience, I shouldn't say lived experience, actually, I should call it lived anxiety. I see it more as we are very good at measuring the flow, but we don't have a consolidated view of the stock. And I think we should be as interested in measuring our stock as our flow, because ultimately all flows lead to a stock. And there is no point of all our flows if at the end of the day we are not measuring our stock with the same intensity. I speak, of course, of assets, whether positive or negative, created in entities such as our partners, mission corporations. And that brings me to my next point. Again, I speak with blinkers as I have been instructed by the chair to speak about my own sector, where you look at the quality of your deficit. The Finance Commission report I've seen mentions, and it mentions with some, it approves of the fact that the fiscal deficit, I beg your pardon, the revenue to fiscal deficit ratio is coming down. Can we have something like that for the power sector and for water utilities, which could be almost mandated to the extent possible from state governments? And that's where I'd like to answer, because I would like to speak a lot more, but like I said, I have a boss to go back to, and I will have probing questions asking me about whatever I speak about. But if we don't have, let me try to, I'm trying to figure out the right way of saying this. If we are able to figure out a way where additional borrowing space is linked to measurable reforms, I believe a lot of the points made in the Commission's report and a lot of the future of the sector, in some sense, will be taken care of. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Krishna. A couple of things I was also Krishna mentioned it. 2,62,000 crores in subsidies the current year by the state agency powers. 2,62,000 crores. A state like Tamil Nadu, otherwise an extremely rich state with wonderful industrialization. The subsidies are 32,000 crores. They don't even want to check the edge. Related to other states, not a share of the consumption, for instance. Rajasthan 27,000 crores, MP 27,000 crores, Karnataka 24,000, AP plus Telangana 31,000. I think something needs to be done. We can't simply go on and have no cost recovery and mounting power sector subsidies, which are really causing enormous strain to state finances. One particular thing, Contact is talking about climate change related policies. Solar power is also very desirable. What's happening with net metering is you are producing power during the daytime and you are given to the grid the surplus power. When the power is banned, you are getting back power and the base load stations are operating at much higher cost. You are a high-end customer. You are not paying tariffs to the state board. You are actually storing power which is high cost, but giving them low cost power. Some states like Kerala recently changed that, and others look at that in climate change policies. I'm a great fan of solar power. I myself produce a bit of solar power, 5 kilowatts at my home. But I cannot draw upon the resources of the state and cost of the industry. I think some thinking is required.
Sir, I have a submission on this matter. There is some sort of operational workaround which does happen here. So what happens is that peak loads, and I think the state, one of the rare good instances of something good happen. The state is locked into very expensive PPAs. A lot of producers, and you can't blame them as well. The technology came about, they require that sort of clarity of profitability. So what we do now, and we do this on a regular basis, part trading, what we do is we look at our peak times, especially the times between say 11 and 2:30, where the preponderance of the solar power is at the highest and we have the lowest amount of it. We back on. We back on all the other generators in the state. And doing this, I think we've saved about 1,228 or odd crores. So this is an operational work. We understand where you're coming from, but that's one way. The other is just the point which you made about the concepts of a lot of loans. It's very difficult to have a very frank conversation here, suppressing the instinct to point your index finger at someone. So I will just mention one who is not in the room. the chairman of such an organization now sits on this table. I refer to the previous chairman, the REC and PFC were very generous in giving power corporation loans. I mean, I'm not, unlike maybe the tenor of a lot of conversation before, my accusation is they are too generous. If they weren't so generous, the state would have gotten their act far earlier. So,
A good model, don't be too generous, be like independent. The last panelist today, before the discussion is Ramesh, the former finance secretary and a very distinguished civil servant on the public information. Ramesh.
Thank you, sir. Chairman, panelists, the distinguished audience. At the outset, I wish to thank the government of Telangana and the Center for Economic and Social Studies for making me part of this conversation. And after a very long day of very distinguished panelists speaking on various technical issues, and then there is a fiery conversation that's awaited sandwiched. So I'll be very brief. And I'll brief and touch upon those matters perhaps that have not been amplified. Number one, there's been a compelling argument between what the Sixteenth Finance Commission has done for the union and for the states. And I think the fact remains that in terms of certain decisions and recommendations that this commission is made in terms of evolution, which is frozen at 41%, not including the cesses and the surcharges as part of the divisible pool, eliminating revenue deficit grant, not having state sector specific grants, and then of course with 40% centrally sponsored schemes where states have to make a contribution, and then pegging the borrowing at 3% of the GSDP. I think there is a challenge as far as the fiscal consolidation expectations of this commission. The second is, as far as the center is concerned, actually there is a roadmap for consolidation. From 4.4% comes to 3.5 over a period of 5 years. Whereas for the states, and given it's such a diverse nation that we are, how each state is uniquely positioned to actually box them in with 3%, notwithstanding the fact that there is special assistance for capital investment, which again is tied to very, very specific interventions, and so which obviously could only be accessible to states. There is a distinct disadvantage in which the states are positioned, and particularly given the diversity of the economic structure of the states. I mean, given Andhra Pradesh, which you rightly amplified how badly the fiscal situation is. And I support you, and I will actually relate my own personal experience. I mean, I've been finance secretary from 2011 to 2017, almost for 5.5 years. And before bifurcation of the state of Andhra Pradesh, when the planning commission was still in place, our fiscal deficit used to be less than 2%. Our revenue deficit was non-existent. This was the Andhra Pradesh before bifurcation. And one of the main reasons when I look back also, I mean, one of those was the planning commission. We used to go back and say the planning, and then the planning commission was a safety guard for us. If the chief minister puts pressure, we would say to the planning commission would agree because we need to go back and engage with them. So in a way, the planning commission as an institutional mechanism did provide not just safeguarding, also provided a mentoring, a support, and also annually, whether people like it or not, it did lay out certain guardrails and also certain guidelines. I mean, this whole, to me, as economic secretary, then the abolition of the the planning commission and its replacement by a director in the DEA really was a huge transition. And in a way, the decline in the state fiscal management, in my view, had also started with that. And then when the state divided in 2014, when I was the finance secretary, certain 14th Finance Commission recommendations actually had helped us substantially, the revenue deficit grants, and some of those state-specific assistance. And so some of it smoothed the transition in Andhra Pradesh. And I must also emphasize that the profligacy which everybody has talked about, and you quite rightly amplified that, had a lot to do with later developments after bifurcation, maybe compulsions of the smaller states. And the smaller state, the political economy operates very, very differently. So I would point out 3-4 important issues and contextualize which have not been amplified. Number one is the power sector reforms, which Krishna referred to. I think there's been quite a bit of a discussion on the Sixteenth Finance Commission report on the power sector, but the recommendation, I mean, the diagnosis seems broadly online, but its recommendation that the privatization of the DISCOMs is a panacea, I think is too simplistic. I have been REC chairman for 3 years, and during which actually I led the National Task Force for both Uday, which transferred the debt from DISCOMs to the states, which state books, which I thought was a bad idea, which I opposed as a finance secretary, but when I went later, the restructuring and then various other things, Upadhyay, and the electrification program, there is a structural problem in the power sector. The structural problem is the easiest subsidy to be given away by the political parties, for the households, to the agriculture, now to the industries. Recently, Andhra Pradesh has announced, I think, almost $1.5 billion subsidy to data centers as electricity data centers. So this is the easiest thing. So in a way, unbundling in 2003-2005 of the power sector, the corporatization actually had happened only in theory. It's continued to be run as government departments. It continued to be treated as government departments. There has been no fiscal discipline. So I think a fundamental restructuring of the review of the power sector and its restructuring is required, not a simplistic privatization, as has been recommended in the Sixteenth Finance Commission. But this is an extremely important reform that's required. The second one is with the state-owned enterprises. Again, there was a recommendation as for a part of the fiscal consolidation. I think it's a good recommendation, but many of the states, particularly Telangana and Andhra, have done away with all the state-owned enterprises, except those like power sector and the state transport utilities and some of those smaller ones. But however, what's the approach again here, sir, is that is what is being disinvested are those profitable state-owned enterprises rather than those which are non-performing or where there is a serious structural managerial challenges. Those actually have not been touched. I mean, the sale of HPCL to ONGC or REC to PFC, I think these were absolutely idiotic in my view from every perspective. National development, fiscal, financial, economic perspective. So I think there is a need, I think, to look at that. Then the third point that the Finance Commission makes is, of course, the revenue improvement, the state-owned revenues. I mean, the revenue elasticity of the GST is really particularly in states which are essentially agrarian, and I'm not even talking about the Northeast and the hill states, but talking about states like Andhra Pradesh, very little elasticity for revenue. There's no doubt there's an efficiency factor there, but in terms of the real, I mean, in the last 3 years, at least last 2 financial years, there's been no growth in excise in Andhra Pradesh. I mean, people cannot keep drinking all the time. So there is a limited point. It's very honest. So and the VAT growth has been on the order of 2-3% year on year. So I think there is possibilities, but there are challenges. The third important thing of this is the profligacy. now subsidies, cash transfers, freebies, and more importantly, the off-budget points. It is incredible. I mean, Dr. Jayaprakash Narayan has pointed out very clearly the innovative financial engineering that some of these states have excelled in.
They started
Have excelled in. In Andhra Pradesh, they have created corporations simply to raise capital. There are corporations that have been raised, the beverages corporation, for example, in Andhra Pradesh. The revenues from the excise have been canalized and securitized for next 10 years to raise revenues. And then an act has been passed, a legislation entrusting the responsibility for implementing welfare programs to beverages corporation. And this legislation has been upheld by the High Court as valid legislation. Here, a consolidated fund revenues, canalized, securitized, and then transferred to a corporation. So a very innovative experiments have been done, and these are completely beyond the reach of either 293(3) or CHO. Now, here is a challenge really when one talks about this type of innovative financing, financial engineering has not been thought about or conceived or even can be visualized, but this is a real problem. So I think FRBM, this is outside the scope, this is outside. So this is a new architecture that needs to be really looked at seriously. So I just close one thing. I think in all this, what I believe is you really need a new financial architecture so that the arguments, whether it is center or the states, and some of those issues which I believe really have not been captured is the demographic transition that's taking place. Not just the fertility decline, but also the migration across the country, state to state. The second is the huge technological transformation, what its impact would be in terms of AI and other technological changes. What about the climate change obligations and its mitigation, the interventions, the investments that require? The whole slew of organization challenges and transformation, and above all, the political economy as we see. And many of the financial engineering is also being done by the political parties which have no stake in the larger national architecture. So I think some of these things I just thought I would highlight. And lastly, I would end by when we talk about capital expenditure, I think Dr. Jayaprakash has clearly mentioned, is there a critical techno-economic analysis that is being done, but much more importantly, the complete disregard for the procurement integrity of the procurement process. I think this is becoming, as the interest and as the outlays for capital expenditure grows, and the potential for the moral hazard is exponentially increasing. I think this is another point that has not been captured in my view. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Just one point before the questions we take. Public sector banks and the CAG asked them to give information about the public debt of state governments. They said on grounds of client confidentiality, they cannot reveal that to the CAG. This actually happened. Now it's rectified because some of us all are it. But things are all to such a solidness. Now it's open to August struggles.
Vijay Kaur, faculty at SES. I have two questions. Pointed one. The Indian government as a whole, to the panel, I am asking this question. The union government clearly appears to be aiming to consolidate its finances at the cost of state. That means by curtailing the tax revolution as well as imposing cess, surcharges, and also controlling to change. How can this coercive central and state relations can be fixed? Is there any way?
Thank you.
So one more question. I have
Time is very short. I think quickly speak. 1 second.
from not just from this panel, but from today's discussion, what I came to know that it appears that the giving freebies has an immense burden on the state finances, where
Question.
we appear to play politicians, but they also follow public sentiments.
Question.
So it is in this context, from academic point of view and finance point of view, we are discussing certain points, but politicians also following what public want.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. Yes.
I have, this is Dr. Srinivas Siva, the political faculty is. I have two quick observations on remarks made by Dr. Jayaprakash Banan sir in the morning and just before the starting of the session. Sir, you have mentioned in the beginning of the session that you are a bit against to capital expenditure, particularly with regard to Kalashkaran project. Sir, is it true that because of this investment on project, the ground level water went up and Telangana has become the rice bowl of India, and the livestock production also went up, and also two seasons of productions of paddy in Telangana.
Capital projects.
Yeah, so it went up, and then the other one you mentioned that the expenditure on education is again doubtful, but then there are a large number of people who are with large number of schools, they don't have toilets, no proper school classrooms, no proper infrastructure.
Yes, next. The gentleman.
So, I'm Silvakara from University of Hyderabad. So I have a quick question, like why we are not getting here with this traditional classical loan funds theory as targets of 3.5% GDP. Although we know there are trends been changing, household financial savings have been changing, and even the current account deficits are also dependent on like every year on different aspects. And still we are like dependent on the same ratios. And why we are not looking into the policy framework based on the endogenous money theories and the post-Keynesian theoretical frameworks.
Thank you. Yes, there's a lady there. Back.
Good evening, sir. Divya, I'm working with the CS office. Sir, I wanted to understand that there are a lot of good ideas that we've heard here from a lot of intellectuals, but politicians operate within the limitation of there being elections almost every year. So they operate from the sentiment of, how to win election. So what is a realistic and palatable way of convincing the politicians to, implement all of these ideas that we're discussing there?
Thank you. I wish we all knew that we get $100. Okay, anybody else? All right, yes.
And Dr. Mallika is a government city college. So we talked about the big debate is the fees. The fees are, as we understand, two types of fees. One is government giving the fees to the industry person, a selected group, and giving it is vulnerable group. So more debate on vulnerable fees rather than KP government giving 95% land. So what kind of out of these fiscal deficit?
So that comes from next branch from even memorial lecturers are also you mentioned this point.
Yes.
Education expense is more, but outcome is less.
Yes.
What are we going to suggest actually? We want to reduce the expense, but education sector as a concept.
Okay, thank you. Next.
Yes, sir. I have a question. Can I?
Amendment.
Sir, I wanted to know the expenditure efficiency. One of the distinguished panelists has spoken. Is GDP the main measure of efficiency? Whatever government expenditure is taking place, this morning you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, sir, that, for example, government spends higher education expenditure. But we want to know what is the outcome, not just the rupees. You see? So, for example, in terms of the research publications, and in terms of the patents, in terms of the startups, in terms of the quality aspect is of deep concern to me. See, so how do we go about it, incorporating it into this? Because SDGs, for example, Government of India is committed to maintain a certain level of SDGs by 2030. But what the NITI do is only collect data. But what I want is who will do the job? Who will do the job of getting the SDG done to reach the target? So can it, if it is built into the Finance Commission, the chief ministers will all act, keeping that as their mind, and so that on SDGs we can further make progress. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Yes, maybe the last question. Very key.
Just make a small observation. My own understanding. I want to know because I've not families and other delegates. Recently, the finance ministers are trying their best to keep the fiscal deficits or mainly fiscal deficit, not revenue deficit also, and to reduce the decimal points just to meet the rule-based targets. That's set by the FRBS and subsequently by the price war. So, one way they are trying to reduce the revenue deficit and fiscal deficit. The other way they are announcing new freebie expenditure schemes. So, in this process, what I observed is the main scapegoat is the social sector expenditure. So that's what I want to share. Thank you.
Thank you.
Somebody raised about savings. I think this is implicitly 6% was done when our household financial savings were somewhere close to 10-11%. Now, right now, it is less than 6%. Now, if you really want to link it to savings, you will be looking at less than 6% fiscal deficit, central and state. So that is not possible right now. And the public expenditure efficiency, one of the points that I forgot to mention, and it's also related to is when we're doing this work for Andhra Pradesh, where we provided intellectual support to the Ladli Behna scheme. One of the things that we said was you need to replace this with some of the schemes that you already have. Now, if you look at it, I asked the finance department how many schemes that we have. There's no information. Okay, similarly, I was doing with some other state. I think that Gayatri is not here, but state of Karnataka. You know, if you look at the scheme, they have 1,800 schemes. Now, how do you run the government and where is the money for freebies and all those things? If you don't really look back to those kind of schemes, and if you don't do this rationalization of schemes and expenditure, I don't think we have resources for any other thing that we talk about. So I think you need to go back to the drawing table and see what schemes need to be prioritized. We say that union has already done that. But when the states, when you look at states, also states are looking at so many, more than 1,000 schemes or 1,000, lines in the budget. So I think we need to look back and see how to set our strategy.
Thank you. I thought Dr. Prabhu was very proud. Apparently, I am very proud. Many of the questions are aimed at me, and this debate is this. Let me therefore conclude negatively. A. I don't want to use the word BB7. It's very disrespectful, inaccurate. These are individual, short-term welfare measures. They are necessary. If United States gives food stamps to 40 million people, the worst richest country, about 14% of the population gets it. It's ridiculous to say we don't want individual short-term welfare. But should there be a measure of balance? Or should we eliminate individual short-term welfare measures too? The only state must. The purpose of state is to pay salaries, distribute this and that. Please think about it. It's not all or nothing. It's not blood. Blood is okay. And even in welfare, I make a very humble appeal, nothing new, nothing original. Distinguished economists and practitioners are here. If three precautions are taken, A, is it sustainable? You have free reinvestment, thousands of crores spending. You have artificially thousands of crores spending, nothing wrong. B, is it capacity enhancing? In all countries that are in capacity and productivity are a challenge. The extent possible is capacity enhancing or only today's consumption without enhancing tomorrow's capacity to pay. C, is it market distortion? Like MSP for rice, overproduction of certain crops. I know again, it's very provocative. I'm a great friend of the farmers. I'm talking the greatest friend of the farmers in this state. I'm aware of it. No, that doesn't mean that we are reckless. Producing more and more rice and wheat, which we don't require, having 80 million tons of stored food grains at the peak time in India, when we actually have short supply of fruits, vegetables, eggs, meat, milk, it's irresponsible, the height of irresponsible. So it is market distortion. The second broadest. In politics, in democratic politics, the biggest challenge is to reconcile the short-term political price you have to pay to protect the long-term public interest. Every economist worth his salt knows that resources are finite, wants are nothing. Therefore, trade-offs, perhaps the most important word in economics is trade-offs. If you ignore that and pretend that there's no problem, what the hell are you talking? Where's the problem then? Why are we discussing all this? If unlimited money is available to do whatever you please, only in the boring place called heaven is impossible. Grow up, fairness. Grow up. Third, punishment. Everything you do has always some benefits. What is the cost? What is the benefit? If the current expenditure per annum, apart from brackets, is coming to 60 to 70,000 rupees. And the net income increase per acre is 15 to 20,000 rupees. It's ridiculous. I'm a great champion of irrigation. My reputation is built on the small irrigation that I built in some shape. But what is the cost? What is the benefit? It's not that Kaleshwaram as a concept is bad. It's not that irrigation as a concept is bad. It's not that something else as a concept is bad. Is it the best use for resources? Are we getting the value out of it? Do not be sentimental. E, education. You should have good education in the village. And I'm grateful to this society and the leadership. The issue is not that you should not really invest in education. Are we investing in education? You know, in Telangana, there are hundreds of schools without a single student enrolled. You know, there are hundreds of schools where the number of teachers outnumber the number of students. Do you know the teacher-student ratio in secondary schools of Telangana is 8 students to 1 teacher, and we recruited 11,000 teachers to advertise on the front page? Do you know the student population actually in that age group, as well as in government, is declining in absolute numbers? We are recruiting more teachers. And of course, we know the outcomes are appalling bad in public education. Because there's no other word, there isn't the word education. What is education? Grow up, for heaven's sake. Don't use a title education. Don't use public sector. Long ago, I discovered, I was also seduced by the word public. After all, public sector is wonderful, private sector is bad. I was special officer of Organised Steel Plant, then India's largest public industry, 8,000 crores in those days. Then I realized that public sector, broadly, is the private sector, those in public office. It is the money of the people of this country. The hard-earned tax money or the borrowed money that children will pay. We have an obligation to build assets and learning capacity for them to be able to pay. You and I have no right to burden them with a debt without giving them the earning capacity. Very exciting. Parents do that, we revile them, they disgust them. The governments do that, we praise them, and give them back power. So let me even say, let's go for the last point, about 3.5% GDP fiscal deficit. One take with a very good. You have to have a varied measurement based on LGDP ratio, the growth rates that the state is experiencing. Because on last day, while things are somewhat bad in many states, I'm very optimistic because we are not Europe. We're not growing at 1% as Europe. We're growing at 6-7% across the board generally. If only we have a bit of discipline, don't have to reduce expenditure. If the expenditure increase, revenue expenditure increase, well short of the revenues increase. If 7% growth is there, 3-4% inflation, nominal growth 10%, revenues 10% growth. If at least the revenue expenditure grows by 2-3% for a few years, even that discipline will not cost them. Ramakrishna told us 7 lakh rupees for achieving India. Of course, I'm delighted they get this salary. Is that what India can afford? A driver in government gets 80,000 rupees. A teacher in the government gets 1,60,000 rupees is too much. Else to the board, lineman gets 1,50,000 rupees. I'm delighted. Market pays 1/5 of that. You pay more than the government of India, 30% more than government of India's salaries. And you want somebody to give money. Where is the money? A rich state is impoverishing. Telangana is a very rich state. The public service is not the state as such, it's impoverishing because of irresponsibility and recklessness. If you think that's the way forward, your children, my children, will get the best. I'm sorry, that's not an option.